Assalamu alaikum. We are having an interview today with a renowned scholar of Islam, Professor Ebrahim Moosa from the University of Nottingham. Assalamu alaikum, Professor.
Wa alaikum salam. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. And my first question will be about your self-identification, because you must know that your fame is great in the world and people identify you differently, sometimes as a scholar of Islam and sometimes as a postmodernist scholar of Islam, sometimes as a reformist Muslim. Do you have any attributes for yourself? How do you identify yourself if it is necessary?
I identify myself as a scholar. I try to do my best. I exert myself in trying to understand an issue and provide my research and my opinions on these matters. So terminology and labels really don't help me, and I think that people who engage with me should rather examine the substance of what I say rather than try to pigeonhole me. As you've just said, that some people call me a modernist, some people call me a scholar, some people a reformist. So I'm very happy that I cannot be pigeonholed into one category. So that's a great. I'm very proud of that.
So when people ask you something, do you give an answer as a Muslim, as a scholar of Islam? Do you need to divide at any of these moments to distinguish between this?
No, I don't think I have to distinguish, because I'm very clear that I'm a Muslim, I'm a scholar, I'm a citizen of the world. All my multiple identities are, at the same time. I cannot separate them. My history, my background, my language in which I've been educated in, and so on, all those happen at the same time. So I don't really have to make that distinction. Yes, what I would make a distinction is, who's my audience? I mean, I talk to a Muslim audience in a particular way, try to understand their symbolism, their languages, their categories to make them understand. When I speak to a international audience, when I speak to different religious or other religious traditions and so on, I try to use categories to make them understand what Islam says on a variety of issues. So it's basically audience dependent.
Mm-hmm. To start our discussion, I wanted to ask you another question about how do you see the concept of knowledge and the concept of truth. For example, Al-Afghani used to say that there should be two types of knowledge. One is for elites and one is for masses. Do you distinguish between these two or not?
I mean, that's a very ancient notion that someone like Al-Ghazali also espoused, and many other scholars, that for the awam, for the lay people, one kind of language is being used, and for the elite another kind, and that you shouldn't mix up the things that you talk to educated people. Don't say that to people of a different kind of literacy and background. So I think it's again what we would today call audience. That if we had a meeting now with a lot of lay public people who don't have very thorough knowledge of, say, theology or Islamic law, and I start using terminology and categories that only people, experts know, then my audience will be bored and they won't understand what I'm saying. So I need to be aware that what the audience is all about, to speak to their level. So, there's a interesting teaching of the Prophet that says, Kalimun nasa ala maratibihim, talk to people on their level of understanding. So if that is what is meant, awam and khawas, I'm not entirely sure. In the earlier medieval world, the idea of the elite and the lay was a very radical one. In this world that we aspire to, in our world that we live in, is the one that we aspire to equality. And so so even lay people have a basic understanding of concepts and issues. At least that's the aspiration. Now, oftentimes lay people have misperceptions because they don't spend enough time in knowing the things, or it is not explained to them well enough and so on, so they can misperceive things. But then also specialists misperceive things. So it's not only people who are experts, they also misperceive things and concepts of Islamic history, of Islamic law and doctrine. So I think what we need to strive at is we need to strive for excellence. In any sphere of work that we do, when we are engaging in public discourse, we must strive for excellence to communicate effectively. And if we are experts, we must also communicate effectively.
So what do you think about the historicity of the Quranic text and Quranic ethics? Is it pretty compatible with the contemporary ethics, or the text should be reinterpreted in order to be compatible with it?
Look, I mean, the Quran as a text has always had its own history. Muslims were very aware of the fact that every verse of the Quran has a asbabun nuzul, has the occasions of revelation, under what circumstances was it revealed. Very soon Muslim jurists also understood that the rules were made in the 7th century Arabia, but 300 years later, 400 years later, they know that these rules in a different environment mean something else. So therefore Muslim jurists start developing categories like al-ahkam al-mabniya al-urfi wal-maslahat tatagayyaru bi-taghayyur az-zamani wal-makan, that the rules that were based on custom and on public interest, that those rules change with an alteration in time and place. Now, Muslim jurists spent a lot of time that a small portion of rules are mentioned in the Quran. Rules, Muslims have always understood that the Quran was revealed at a particular time and particular place, and all, especially those rules that got to do with practices. The Quran has a small number of these verses that deal with rules and practice known as ahkam verses. And Muslims were very clear that these practices were part of the society of 7th century Arabia, and that the Quran, it was included in the Quran because it played a particular role and particular function. Lots of the rules were not included in the Quran, but they were supported by the hadith of the Prophet, by the sunnah, and with the companions' expertise also makes another set of rules. So I think too much has been made about the rules and the understanding of the rules, because when Muslims, in 200 years later, in a different context, whether it is in Spain, whether it's in Iraq, Muslims quickly understand that these rules were made under particular circumstances. They met certain conventions, they fulfilled certain objectives of conventions, of custom, or some of these rules were based on public interest. And so Muslims very soon developed certain maxims and rules that said, al-ahkam al-mabniya al-urfi wal-maslaha tatagayyaru bi-taghayyur az-zamani wal-makan, that the rules that are based on public interest and on custom, they change with a change in the place and time. So the big question is that people are still struggling with, that how many of the verses of the Quran are actually customary verses, customary practices? How many of those verses have to do with questions of public interest? Now, there's a distinction between verses that deal with ibadat, that is those of worship, about fasting and prayer and pilgrimage and zakat. Those are seen as kind of core practices, and they hardly undergo any change, except that the Hajj is becoming very big, and so now they have to extend the place where you throw the pelt, the Satan, the Jamarat, and so they build it bigger. And because there's such a huge public, there are certain times that you must throw after midday on the first day. You must start throwing, but there's so many people, so now there's permission to do it maybe in the morning already. All these rules can, even though they are ibadat and they have to be done exactly the way the Prophet had done it, yet under different circumstances, even those rules become elastic. So now we do the throwing of the Jamarat when there's a huge crowd. We started doing after Fajr already. Started throwing it. That is not the Sunnah. But now they've also made the place more spacious, so now it is safer. So now the time has gone back to after Zawal, after the noontime throwing. So this has been the subject of a lot of debate and discussion. And so the historicity has always been subject to conversation. This is not a new thing. This is not a new thing. People who know the jurisprudence, know Islamic law, know that the historical questions were always there from the get-go.
So I wanted to ask you, in the course of your speeches here in Kuala Lumpur, you mentioned very interesting term as Protestantization of Islam. And also another question, as far as Protestantism is involved, what do you think about the separation of mosque and state for Islam?
Well, I mean, I've not said the word Protestantization for the first time. I've said it before. and I use it loosely, and that is that what has happened in the 19th and 20th century is that Muslims have basically moved away from following authority and the question of taqleed and following law schools, canonical law schools, which was basically the authority of Islam's teachings, and moved away from that into a modality of anti-taqleed and pro-ijtihad. And so while in my view ijtihad is not satisfactory and people are not doing decent ijtihad, but what has happened is that individual Muslims have now abandoned the madhab and following the best interpretation that they find. And so what is happening is a certain process of self-selecting. The individual selects, whereas before the tradition chose you. When you were a traditional Muslim, you have very little choice. The tradition chooses you. You belong to the Hanafi school tells you you must do this. The Shafi school tells you to do this, right? So you listen to the school chooses you. What has now happened is that Muslims have now said, no, on this matter we're going to follow the Shafi school, on that matter we're going to follow the Hanafi school, on this matter none of the schools said we're going to follow a new ijtihad. Now we are self-selecting. And that is what I mean that in the same way that what happened in Protestantism, the authority of the church, the Catholic Church, was undermined by reformers, and maybe it was an inevitability that this happened in Christianity. Also, I'm not blaming what happened in Islamic thought. I'm just explaining that new developments took place, and Muslims too had to begin to self-select and choose for themselves, because the idea of individual responsibility, the idea that you are accountable to yourself, that no imam or religious leader is going to intercede for you on a day of judgment. You have to face God for yourself. So this notion of individualism that becomes part of the spirit of the time as a result of certain forms of political, economic developments, liberalism, capitalism, creates certain kind of notion of the self. And Muslims are aware of that notion of the self, or even a socialist self, or even a hybrid socialist capitalist self. The self is always made by the environment. And so therefore I say that Muslims have moved in the direction of a certain kind of Protestant identity, where they are doing religion by themselves and no longer following the teachings of an imam who tells them how to do things, but they go to different imams to get different things, or they go on the internet and find different teachings, or they say, ask the imam on the internet or something of that sort.
So with this kind of diversity, how do we see Ummah, which should have its integrity? Can we think of Ummah as?
Yeah, the Ummah has never been a monolithic thing. The Ummah has always been the broadest, congregation of Muslims, and some people try to define the Ummah in narrow ways, and some people try to define the Ummah in broad terms. So, even sects that are maybe not orthodox but they're heterodox, technically are within the Ummah. So the Ummah is sometimes used as a political category, and sometimes the Ummah is used as an ecclesiastical category. And so we must be very careful, when do you use the Ummah as a political idea, entity, where the Ummah represents the political will, and when do we think about as this being a kind of a ecumenical activity between different interpretation and different theologies of Muslims. And that's always been very diverse and always been tension-ridden and always been a place of argument and debate, which has always been a productive thing.
Thank you. So passing to the topics and discussions you had here in Kuala Lumpur about extremism, countering violent extremism, and if Islam is a religion of peace, they all are interconnected somehow. Based on your vast knowledge about recent developments within Islam, how do you see the roots of the rise of extremism and religiously based extremism?
I think the rise of religious extremism has a number of causes. I think one of them is the absence of good governance in Muslim societies, frustration, and the bad material conditions that are prevalent among Muslims. But that's not the only reason, but that could be one factor that drives and creates a certain kind of frustration. And that frustration then looks for solutions. And the solutions people find they find simplistic solutions in the religion. And so the other big problem for violent extremism is illiteracy. illiteracy known as literacy. So people think they are literate in the questions of religion, but it's actually a very deep illiteracy. So they try to think that, Islam is the solution. What do they mean by that? They mean the application of Sharia. When you ask them, what do you mean by Sharia? They can only say cutting off of hands and chopping off people's heads for some offenses, and that's their understanding of Sharia. That is a very dangerous understanding of Sharia. They don't understand that Sharia is about the cultivation of developing excellence in character. That is the core of Sharia. But what they have in mind is a kind of very legalistic understanding of Sharia. But unfortunately, that goes under the name and under the sign of literacy, of religiosity. So that is another driver. And another driver for a certain kind of extremism is utopian ideas. A utopian idea, not understanding that religion in the world today is very different from religion 500 years ago. In 500 years ago, 800 years ago, 1,000 years ago, religion and politics were very closely webbed and weaved together. So your religious identity and your political identity were almost similar, and they overlapped. In the modern world, new changes have come about in which we have separated religious identity and political identity. Now, people might not be happy with it or might be dissatisfied with this new model, but this is the conditions under which we live. Now, if you want to change it, you need to persuade other people that we want to bring back religion and theology, but you need to persuade people, you need to make an argument, and you need to win over the support of people in order to do so. You can't force it down people's throats. And unfortunately, there's a big question mark whether that kind of understanding of religion and politics will be workable in a multicultural, multi-religious societies that Muslims are living in and so on. Or in societies where Muslims themselves are diverse, so you can't have a Sunni state Islam when a sizable population are Shia, or people belonging to the Zaydis, or people belonging to the Ahmadi. What kind of teaching is going to come from the state? In the past, when Muslims were pluralistic, and they had pluralism. So for instance, if we go into Mamluk Cairo, in Mamluk Cairo you could go to a Maliki court, a Shafi court, a Hanafi court, a Ismaili court. There was pluralism. And so the state fostered pluralism. What we have today is that the modern state is a very monolithic apparatus. It's not very good at dealing with diversity and pluralism. And so one of the ways that we deal with diversity and pluralism is to make sacred the idea of freedom of speech. You make the notion of freedom of speech a sacred idea, and you say everybody can speak freely. Yes, some speech will be injurious, some speech will be ugly and create bad reactions, but people must control themselves. People must control themselves, because if you want to say your say, then you must allow other people to say their say also. And yes, you might be able to say, don't say such speech that will create injury in other people. So let's cultivate a certain kind of code of conduct, a nice way of speaking, that you can still make your own convictions known without offending the other side. Okay? And even if you have to criticize the other side, you need to do in such a way that you criticize the idea and not the person. That you criticize and don't injure the person, and don't create violence within people, that people respond violently. So that's the kind of mechanism we have done in the nation-state model and in the kind of liberal understanding of the state. Now, there are other notions of the state that we can also have. What many people who are interested in political Islam do not understand is how the modern nation-state works. So they think they're going to have the nation-state, but they're going to have Sharia. And Sharia is going to only make Islamic ideas legitimate and all other non-Islamic ideas illegitimate, until someone else takes over the state and then puts those people who are calling for Sharia, put them in jail and put other people in power. So I think these notions of political Islam are very immature, requires a great deal of deliberation and study. And I think that Muslim religious leadership, they are failing in educating the Muslims. They are failing because their own education is deficient. There's a huge deficits in the education of Muslim religious scholars themselves, or those people who proclaim to be religious scholars. They don't know enough about the historical tradition, nor do they know how to apply the tradition, and about the knowledge of the world in which they are living, they know very, very little. And so we are confronted by a very big crisis in Islamic thought.
So how do we tackle this issue? How we inculcate this makarim al-akhlaq, the noble character, into people, education, family? What are the solutions?
I think you've just mentioned it. Through educational systems, we need to teach in our secular schools, in our religious schools, through family practices, and so on. I mean, people tell me that in Malaysia, for instance, that people are not very courteous. People that don't have courtesy, don't give a seat for a woman or for an elderly person. My first question is, don't they teach this at home? Shouldn't these things be taught at home? Because these are questions of adab and akhlaq, etiquette and moral values that begins at home. It's reinforced by the school and then furthermore reinforced in the public sphere, but it begins at home. So these are huge deficits, and it seems that ethical knowledge is deficient within homes and in families. Today there was a report in a Malaysian newspaper talking about the levels of corruption in Malaysia. Okay, 50%. Malaysia is now number 50 on the global index of perception of corruption. The question is, Malaysia is also a religious society. So what does that say? What kind of religiosity is this? That people are religious and they tolerate corruption. Okay, that means that the religion is not teaching them not to be corrupt, or religion is either silent about corruption, and maybe people are talking about what kind of words Christians must use and what kind of words they must use about the dog and touching the dog and those kind of things. These become all notions and ideas that deflect people's attention from the real issues.
Yes.
The real issue is corruption. The real issue is about equality. The real issue is about freedom of all the religions. But what happens is that people's attention is deflected to football kits and what kind of kits that people should wear, and about whether Christians can use the word Allah or not, or whether you can touch a dog or not touch a dog. These are all deflections from the real issues. So people create these side shows, which is a major ruse that is played on the people, and it's a very sad commentary on whoever is making these kinds of deflections and not addressing the real issues.
How about the people who join Daesh, ISIS from the Western countries? What kind of frustration you think they have? What they are driven by? I
think that many of them are driven by their unhappiness living in the West, or they've been in trouble, they went to jail, or they are disenchanted by their lives there. Or they feel that they don't have a good literacy, so they think that living in England or France is a horrible situation. They don't want to live there. They might have been experiencing racism, so partly the host society possibly did not treat them very well, and now they think that the real great and the best society that they can live in is in a caliphate, where Sharia will apply, and they will be key players in that, and they will be the jihadis and the mujahids for that. And so they go for the utopia, and soon they will realize that those jihadi states and those utopian states don't deliver anything. I mean, many people tried to go to Saudi Arabia because they thought Sharia is implemented in Saudi Arabia, and after a few years they run back. When Iran, 79, Iranian revolution was created, they had the Iranian state. Lots of people want to go to Iran. They soon realized that it's not a great place. I know from South Africa, for instance, there's a Malay community in South Africa, who many of them thought now that Malaysia is an open society and a great society, they will come back to Malaysia and they start living here. Many of them could not even last 2-3 years, and they realized that, well, Malaysia is not the place for them. So, what people must recognize that you need to be invested in your South Africa or in your Malaysia or your Singapore or your France. That is your society. You make Islam your home there. That's your home. You plant your Islam there, you grow your Islam there, and you struggle with your Islam there. Flying around the world and trying to find your ideal world, because you know France better than anybody else. You can make things happen in France if you're a French person. You can't do the same thing in Malaysia. You don't understand Malaysia if you're a French person. You're a foreigner when you come here. It'll take you 20 years to understand what Malaysian life is. And what are you going to do in Malaysia? Cause trouble? So I think that this is the dissatisfaction that people have in various countries by going to the caliphate and going to ISIS and so on, is running away from the problem rather than coming back and addressing the issues.
Understood. So my last question will be in relation to our topic and knowledge, because you mentioned that people who used to teach and preach, they are not always literate in other issues, but some tenets of religion. Many institutions in relation to the Daesh insurgents issued fatwas and opinions condemning them or supporting them. In your mind, which institutions are credible enough to issue these kind of opinions and they have this necessary understanding? If you are not comfortable, you...
No, I mean, there are institutions, there are a group of scholars who issued a statement condemning Daesh or condemning ISIS and so on. There are many credible individuals there, so I think the idea that a group of scholars and local authorities in different countries issued statements is a good way of educating the world that Muslims do not identify, and credible Orthodox traditional Muslims don't identify with ISIS and its activities and so on. And that is only a protest, but many of these organizations or individuals, they hold views similar, or they hold views that can create their own Daesh in their own context and so on. So while they don't like Daesh because Daesh is doing some unhappy things that are very brutal and are murderous and so on, and they don't like that. But some of these people's organizations, their own teachings result into despotism and authoritarian teaching. So what the solution is that Muslim religious leadership requires, maybe not the existing leadership, but the next generation requires a whole new way of being educated in Islam. And therefore governments and civil society have a responsibility to create institutions. Existing universities and departments of Islamic studies need to upgrade themselves, have more courageous conversations, don't have closed-minded scholars who are scared to think aloud about questions about Islam and create new conversations, because otherwise they are just going to create Daesh types or ISIS types and worse. So ISIS did not fall out of the sky. ISIS was created by religious communities in Britain, in France, in Iraq, in Turkey, in Kurdistan, all those places where these people come from. They were created on the ground. They didn't fall from the sky. But it's now become ISIS's problem because ISIS became the place where they are drawn. But they've been produced in different parts in the West and in the Islamic world. They've been produced and nurtured by these very same scholars who are today condemning them.
That's a very important point.
And that's one of the things that people are not appreciating and not thinking through, because Muslims are always going for kind of, putting Band-Aid. Band-Aid is just to put it on the wound, but really not addressing the wound. And the wound is ignorance. And ignorance in the name of knowledge. You see, so people who think they are learned know a little bit, and they think that is the end of knowledge. A learned person always knows that I know a little, and there's a lot more to learn. And you have to, as Ghazali always taught us, that the three things of a Ghazalian hermeneutic is that you must never refute reason, always have humility and say, I do not know all. And thirdly, that there's always a multiplicity of opinions, and don't attach yourself to one opinion, but say that I'm holding this opinion, but there are also other opinions and I'm aware of that, and other people can also espouse it. So a plurality of interpretation, intellectual humility, and that we have a basis for conversation amongst people who disagree on the basis of reason and reasonableness. And I think that's one of the things that I learned from Ghazali and I wish to share with others.
It's a very important point for all the believers all over the world to remember.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor, for your interview.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.